There is something strange about the way humans have always related to their gods. Not just reverence, not just gratitude, something older and more complicated than that. Something that lives in the chest rather than the mind. A kind of awe that has edges sharp enough to cut. And if you go back far enough, back past the Greek temples and the Roman pantheons, back past the earliest books of the Bible, you find a civilization sitting between two great rivers, under a sky they watched with terrifying attention, and they had a name for the forces that ran the universe. The Anunnaki. Say it quietly. It sounds like something you'd find carved into stone at the bottom of a very deep room. Now here's the question that pulled this whole story together. Why would people who built temples, who composed hymns, who organized entire cities around divine worship, why would those same people be so deeply, genuinely afraid of the beings they worshipped? That seems like a contradiction at first. You build a house for something you love. You don't usually build a house for something you're terrified of. But in ancient Mesopotamia, those two things weren't opposites. They were the same feeling. Reverence and dread didn't cancel each other out. They were woven together like the two threads of a single cord. The Anunnaki weren't feared despite being worshipped. They were feared because of it. That idea is what this whole journey is about. And if you're already settled in somewhere quiet, maybe with the lights off or the window cracked, good. This is the kind of story that works better in the dark. Drop a comment and tell me where you're listening from and what time it is there. I love seeing those. Last time I checked the comments, there was someone in Melbourne at 2 a.m. and someone in Montreal eating breakfast, and both of them reading about ancient gods. That's something now. The Anunnaki. Let's establish something basic before we go deeper. In the oldest Sumerian texts scratched into clay tablets some 5,000 years ago, the Anunnaki appear as a collective of major divine beings, a council, an assembly of powers that governed the cosmos. The word itself is ancient Sumerian, and scholars generally interpret it as meaning something like those of royal blood or the princely offspring, referring to their divine parentage and cosmic rank. They weren't minor spirits or household gods. These were the ones who decreed fates, who met in divine assembly to decide what would happen to kingdoms, to harvests, to individual human lives. Later in Akkadian texts, in Babylonian mythology, the name expanded in meaning and sometimes referred specifically to the gods of the underworld. Both uses matter, and we'll follow both threads tonight. It's worth noting that the Anunnaki are not a simple unified category. Different texts, different cities, different centuries of Mesopotamian history shaped them in different ways. Scholars still debate the precise boundaries of who counted as Anunnaki and when. So when you hear modern retellings, books and documentaries that present the Anunnaki as a neat, consistent mythology, treat that with some gentle skepticism. The actual ancient sources are messier and more interesting than most modern summaries suggest. But here's what is clear. Whether you're reading a Sumerian hymn from Ur, a Babylonian creation epic from 1,000 years later, or a royal lament from a king watching his city burn, one thing runs through all of it. These beings were not safe. They were powerful in a way that human beings experience as overwhelming. Not the warm, comforting power of a protector necessarily, though that was sometimes part of it. The power of forces that don't require your consent. The power of a flood. The power of a verdict. The power of a fever arriving in the night and not leaving. There are several threads in this story, and they're worth knowing in advance because they all come back to the same central knot. There's judgment, the Anunnaki as arbiters of fate, gathering in assembly to decide who lives and who suffers, and for how long. There's the decree, the concept the Sumerians called the me, the divine laws and attributes that governed all of civilization, held by gods who could give them and take them away. There's the underworld, that cold and dusty realm where a different configuration of the Anunnaki sat as judges of the dead, a place so grim that even other gods were afraid to descend into it. And there's royal power, the terrifying idea that a king's authority was only ever borrowed from heaven, lent by the gods and revocable at any moment, for reasons that weren't always explained. Running through all of these is dread. Not the shallow dread of a horror story, but the deep existential dread of people who believed the universe was governed by conscious, powerful, capricious forces, and that those forces were watching. That whether or not your crops grew, whether or not your child survived the fever, whether or not your city was destroyed, all of it was connected to whether the gods were pleased. And the gods, the record suggests, were not easy to please. They could be appeased, they could be flattered, honoured, fed with offerings, approached through ritual. But they could never be fully predicted, and they could never be safely ignored. That combination, the attempt to approach what you cannot fully know, to honour what could destroy you, is what drove some of the most sophisticated religious literature the ancient world ever produced. And that's where we're going tonight. Through the storm god's wrath and the love goddess's terror, through the courtrooms of the underworld and the anxiety of kings who knew their power wasn't really theirs, through laments and omens and offerings made with trembling hands. Let's start at the beginning. Who exactly were the Anunnaki in the oldest sources we have? The earliest clay tablets we have don't announce the Anunnaki with a fanfare. They don't open with a neat definition or a numbered list of members. They just use the term the way you'd use the word family or council, as if the audience already understood roughly what was meant, which tells you something important right away. By the time people were writing things down, around 5,000 years ago in the river cities of southern Mesopotamia, the Anunnaki were already an established concept, already woven into the fabric of how people understood the world. The writing wasn't introducing them. The writing was simply recording what everyone already knew. The word itself is Sumerian, Anunna, sometimes extended to Anunnaki, and the scholarly consensus on its meaning centers on ideas of divine descent and high status. Something in the range of those of princely seed or the offspring of the heavens, referring to their parentage from the sky god An, who sat at the apex of the Sumerian divine hierarchy. An was distant, elevated, the god of the vault of heaven itself. His children, his court, his assembly of divine powers, those were the Anunna. They weren't gods you'd encounter casually. They were the ones who held authority at the highest levels, the ones whose decisions shaped the fundamental conditions of existence. In the earliest Sumerian material, the Anunna appear most clearly in contexts of collective divine authority. They gather, they deliberate, they decree. Individual gods had individual personalities and domains. But the Anunna as a group represented something more like the governing council of the cosmos. When fate was decided for a city or a king or a human life, it was often the Anunna who were understood to have made that decision, assembled in some divine space beyond human access and rendering verdicts that would then manifest in the world below as floods, victories, famines, or sudden illness. One of the clearest windows into how this worked comes from Sumerian literary texts, compositions we now call myths and hymns, though the people who wrote them probably didn't experience that distinction as sharply as we do. In texts like the Descent of Inanna, or various hymns to Enlil, the Anunna appear as a backdrop of divine authority. They're present at key moments, they ratify decisions. Their response to a god's actions, their silence or their cry of assent, carries enormous weight. They function less like individual characters and more like the collective voice of cosmic law. When they speak as one, the universe listens. But here's where it gets more complicated, because the term wasn't used uniformly across time or across genres. Mesopotamian civilization lasted roughly 3,000 years in its literate form, from the early Sumerian city-states, through the Akkadian Empire and the various Babylonian and Assyrian periods that followed. That's longer than the entire span from ancient Rome to right now. Over that sweep of time, texts changed. Cities rose and fell. Scribal traditions shifted. Gods were merged, elevated, demoted, or reinterpreted to suit new political realities. And the word Anunnaki shifted with all of that. In the older Sumerian material, Anuna tends to refer to the great gods collectively, the divine assembly of heavenly and earthly powers, the highest tier of a cosmic hierarchy. But in Akkadian texts from the 2nd millennium BCE, a different usage starts to appear more prominently. The Anunnaki become associated specifically with the underworld. Not the heavenly assembly, but the chthonic powers, the gods who presided over the realm of the dead. The Babylonian creation epic known as the Enuma Elish, composed probably sometime in the 2nd millennium and preserved in copies from later periods, uses the Anunnaki in ways that emphasize their role as divine workers, beings assigned to labor by the higher gods, beings whose complaints about their burdens actually drive the creation of human beings. That's a different flavor entirely from the remote, authoritative assembly of earlier texts. There's also a distinction that appears in some Babylonian material between the Anunnaki and another group called the Igigi, a pairing that divided divine labor and divine rank in ways scholars still debate. In some texts, the Igigi are the heavenly gods, and the Anunnaki are the underworld gods. In others, the categories overlap or contradict each other entirely, depending on the context and the period. The Mesopotamians weren't constructing a systematic theology with consistent definitions. They were producing literature, ritual texts, hymns and laments over centuries and millennia, and those texts reflect all the local variation and historical change you'd expect from any living tradition. What this means in practice is that there isn't a single fixed canon of Anunnaki, the way a modern reader might hope to find. You can't compile a definitive list of members, assign each one a clear role, and call it done. Different cities had different traditions. The scribes of Nippur emphasized different aspects than the scribes of Ur. The Anunnaki in a royal hymn celebrating a king's divine mandate feel different from the Anunnaki in an underworld myth or a lament over a city's destruction, even if the name is the same. Scholars today are careful about this, and it's worth being careful too. When you read modern books or watch documentaries that flatten all of this into a single consistent mythology, they're usually working from a selection of the most dramatic or most often translated texts, and they're smoothing over the inconsistencies that make the actual ancient records so interesting. The Anunnaki aren't a simple thing. They're a complex cluster of ideas that evolved across thousands of years and dozens of different contexts. Any account that tells you exactly what they were with total confidence is probably telling you what they wanted to find, rather than what the tablets actually say. What the texts can tell us, reliably across many periods and many genres, is something about the emotional and conceptual weight the Anunnaki carried. They were associated with authority at its most fundamental level. Not the authority of a local official or even a king, but the authority that precedes and underlies all of that. The authority of cosmic law, the decree that makes day and night, the verdict that assigns a lifespan, the decision that determines whether a city flourishes or falls. When the Anunnaki are mentioned in royal inscriptions, it's often in the context of legitimacy, the king's power flowing from divine approval, the Anunnaki having chosen this ruler or granted this victory. When they appear in laments, it's often as the ones whose decision brought catastrophe, whose turning away from a city allowed its enemies to destroy it. There's a Sumerian text known as the Lament for the Destruction of Ur, composed after the city of Ur was destroyed by invaders around 2000 BCE. In that text, the disaster isn't random and it isn't purely military. It's theological. The gods, the Anuna among them, made a decision. They decreed the city's fate, and the horror of the lament isn't just grief over destruction. It's the vertigo of understanding that the beings who had protected the city, who had been worshipped in its temples, who had made it great, those same beings had also decreed its end. That's not comfortable religion. That's something far more unsettling. And that quality, that combination of sustaining power and devastating authority, runs through virtually every period and genre in which the Anunnaki appear. They're not simply villains, and they're not simply benevolent patrons. They're something harder to categorize. They're the forces that run the universe. And the universe does not organize itself around human comfort. There's also the problem of what the texts can't tell us. We're working from clay tablets, many of them fragmentary, many of them copied and recopied by scribes in schools over centuries, many of them discovered in archaeological contexts that remove them from their original settings. We don't know how much of the tradition was never written down at all. Oral traditions, local customs, the things people said quietly at home rather than in formal temple contexts, those are almost entirely gone. What we have is a selection probably weighted toward official literary and ritual material rather than everyday belief. The Anunnaki as they appear in texts may be a somewhat elevated, formalized version of something more varied and textured in actual lived experience. So hold all of this with some lightness. The Anunnaki were a collective of major divine powers in Sumerian and Akkadian thought, associated with cosmic authority, divine assembly, the issuance of fate, and in later periods especially with the governance of the underworld. The term shifted in meaning across time and across different types of texts. The tradition wasn't uniform and it wasn't static. Different cities, different centuries, different scribal traditions all shaped the concept in different ways. But underneath all of that variation, something remained consistent. Something that matters for everything we're going to explore tonight. The Anunnaki, in whatever form they took, represented power that was real, was comprehensive, and was not controllable by human beings. You could approach it. You could try to honor it. You could perform the correct rituals, make the correct offerings, speak the correct prayers. But you could not negotiate from a position of strength. You could not assume goodwill. And you could never, under any circumstances, afford to ignore them. That, in the end, is where the dread begins. If you lived in southern Mesopotamia 4,000 years ago, you didn't need a philosopher to explain human vulnerability to you. You just had to look at the river. The twin rivers, Tigris and Euphrates, were the reason your city existed at all. Their floods watered the fields, brought fresh silt, made grain possible in a land that would otherwise have been desert. But those same rivers could rise too high, too fast, at the wrong time. A late flood could flatten the barley just before harvest. An early one could drown the seedlings before they took root. A breach in the levee could turn an entire district into slurry overnight. From our distance, it's tempting to call this environmental risk. For them, it was the personality of the gods. Rain didn't just fail. The storm god turned his face away. Irrigation canals didn't just silt up. Someone in power had lost favour. When an entire year's harvest depended on the balance between too much water and too little, between a timely flood and a catastrophic one, the idea that the world was governed by impersonal laws would have felt hollow. The world felt personal, volatile, capricious, alive with intention. And it wasn't just the water. Drought could stretch on for years. Winds could scour the fields with dust and salt. Animal diseases could wipe out herds. A fever could move through a crowded quarter and take children by the dozen. City walls that had stood for generations could be breached in a single night by an enemy whose own gods, apparently, had decided to give them victory. All of this created a certain cast of mind, a sense that life rested on a knife edge. That stability was the exception, not the rule. When you live like that, you look for patterns. You look for the forces behind the events. And in Mesopotamia, those forces were overwhelmingly divine. One of the central ideas that crystallized this feeling was the notion of decrees. In Sumerian and Akkadian, there are terms, Mi, Nam, Shimtu, that scholars translate as divine ordinances, destiny, fate, or decrees, these weren't vague vibes. They were imagined as concrete assignments: a city's prosperity, a king's rule, a person's lifespan, even the proper course of a river, all established by spoken decisions in the divine assembly. The gods, and above all the great gods gathered as the Anunna, didn't just influence events. They set the terms, they pronounced what would be so. And once pronounced, those decrees were understood as terrifyingly effective. A divine word once issued did not return empty, but there was a darker edge to this comforting cosmic order. Decrees could change. Text after text returns to the same nightmare. A god who once blessed a city decides, for reasons that may or may not be made clear, to revoke its charter. A protective deity abandons its temple. The lifespans of humans are shortened. Fortunes are reversed. In laments and hymns the language is stark. The heart of the god becomes angry. The eye of the god turns malevolent. The decree for life becomes a decree for death. To live in such a world was to know that everything you depended on, from the predictability of seasons to the continuity of your city, was contingent on a favour you did not control. This is where the dread begins to deepen, not as fear of some abstract evil, but as a steady awareness of uncertainty. Dependence on divine favour didn't just produce gratitude, it produced vigilance. If your land yielded, your children thrived, your household stayed intact for a few years in a row, it wasn't enough to feel lucky. You had to ask why, which gods were pleased, which rituals had been performed correctly. What obligations now rested on you to keep the decree in your favour? And if things went badly, the questions were sharper. Had someone sinned? Had a ritual been neglected? Had your city's patron lost standing in the assembly of the gods? The idea that misfortune might be random or purely natural was not the default. The default was, somewhere at some level, a divine decision had been made, or a divine protection had been withdrawn. This is important for understanding why people feared the Anunnaki more than they simply honoured them. It wasn't that the gods were imagined as simple villains. In many texts they are protectors, givers of kingship, granters of wisdom and abundance, but because they were thought to sit above every human arrangement, their choices could overturn everything without appeal. So ordinary life became a kind of ongoing negotiation with that unseen volatility. Omens were one way of coping. If human beings couldn't attend the divine assembly, they could at least try to read the minutes afterward, encoded in the patterns of the world. Burnt offerings were examined. The livers of sacrificed animals were read like documents, each mark and shape interpreted as a sign of what the gods had decided. The flight of birds, the behaviour of smoke, the appearance of strange births in animals or humans, these became data points in a vast evolving system of divination. An eclipse of the moon might signal danger for a king. A particular arrangement of stars could be read as a warning for a city. Clay tablets from first millennium Assyria preserve lists upon lists of such correspondences. If this sign appears, then this fate is coming. It wasn't superstition in the casual, dismissive sense. It was a technology of anxiety management, a way to feel out, however imperfectly, the current state of divine intention. But omens on their own were only half the story. If a sign suggested that a decree had turned against you, you needed some way to respond. That's where prayers and offerings came in, not just as expressions of devotion, but as attempts at damage control. Daily life in a Mesopotamian city was threaded through with acts of piety, temple rituals on behalf of the community, household offerings to family gods, quiet prayers murmured at thresholds and crossroads. The surviving texts highlight the formal side, the hymns recited by priests, the elaborate meals laid out before divine statues. But it's likely that ordinary people carried these concerns into their own routines, a quick gesture to a protective deity before leaving home, a whispered plea when a child fell ill. The logic behind all of this wasn't that you could bribe a god into doing what you wanted. It was subtler and more unsettling. You couldn't compel the gods, but you could fail them. You could offend without realizing it. You could neglect some duty or utter some careless oath that shifted your standing in ways you might not notice until the results arrived as a failed harvest or an invading army. That possibility that you might be walking around under a darkened decree without yet seeing its effect kept the fear alive. At the same time, it kept hope alive too, because if misfortune was the result of divine displeasure, then perhaps it could be reversed by renewed attention, confession, ritual apology. Many prayers from later Babylonian and Assyrian periods circle this theme. The supplicant admits, "I do not know what sin I have committed," but asks the god to relent, to change the decree, to restore favour. The universe here is not morally simple, but it is, in some fragile way, responsive. Notice what this dread is attached to. It's not primarily about demons lurking in the dark or an ultimate evil force trying to destroy the world. Those elements do appear in Mesopotamian religion, especially in later demonological texts and incantations. But the deepest, most consistent anxiety in the sources is directed not at rogue malevolent beings, but at the very powers that sustain existence. The fear comes from not knowing where you stand with them, and from understanding that your standing can change. A city can be flourishing under its god's protection one generation and desolate the next, with its temples smashed and its people scattered. A king can be raised up as chosen by the Anunnaki, and later described in the same tradition as having been handed over to his enemies by those same gods. A healthy person can fall suddenly ill. A prosperous household can collapse in debt or fire, and behind each reversal people imagined a shift in the invisible ledger of favour and decree. So the Mesopotamian world was not simply a place where bad things happen. It was a place where every significant change, good or bad, might be evidence that something in the divine realm had moved. That orientation to events created a particular emotional climate, a mixture of gratitude and suspicion, devotion and unease. You honoured the gods because your life depended on them. You feared them for the same reason. And somewhere behind the individual deities, behind the storm god and the love goddess and the city patrons, there was that assembly of great powers, the Anunnaki, whose collective decisions set the larger frame. The floods and droughts, the rise and fall of cities, the shortening of lifespans, the granting or stripping of kingship. These were the kinds of outcomes imagined as flowing from their councils. To live in their world was to know that the ground beneath your feet could be withdrawn not by accident, but by verdict. In the next part of this story, we move a little closer to that high divine court. We'll look at how the Mesopotamians pictured the assembly itself, the terrifying moment when the gods sit in judgment, speak their decrees, and send them rippling down into the fragile lives of human beings below. When Mesopotamian texts talk about the gods, they rarely mean a lone figure acting in isolation. Again and again, they come back to a collective scene, the divine assembly. Different myths imagine it in slightly different ways. Sometimes it's a gathering by a river, sometimes in a great hall, sometimes in the heavens. But the logic is consistent. The great gods, and especially the Anunnaki, assemble the way a royal court does. There is a presiding deity with special authority. Enlil in many Sumerian traditions, later Marduk in Babylonian theology. But decisions are discussed, argued, ratified by more than one voice. In the Atrahasis epic, when humans have multiplied and become noisy, disturbing the gods, it isn't one irritated deity who snaps. The gods hold council. They debate options. They agree, step by step, on increasingly severe measures, plagues, famine, eventually the flood. In the flood story embedded in the Epic of Gilgamesh, the same pattern appears. A divine meeting, a verdict, human beings as the object of policy. That image, a room full of unseen powers talking about you, Deciding what kind of world you will wake up in tomorrow runs through the literature. On one level, it reflects the political reality of Mesopotamian life. Cities were governed by councils and kings. Cases were heard before assemblies of elders. To think of the gods as operating through a kind of higher court was to project familiar structures upward. But here is where the dread deepens. A human court might be swayed. You could see the judges, make your case, appeal to their pity or their self-interest. The divine assembly, by contrast, was essentially closed. You did not attend. You were not heard personally. At best, your city's patron god or your personal protective deity might speak for you in that higher meeting. Texts sometimes imagine exactly that. A minor god pleading on behalf of his worshippers, asking that a harsh decree be softened. But for the ordinary person, this was all behind a veil. You felt the decisions, you never witnessed the debates. Collective judgment in this context feels more unstoppable than the anger of a single god. An individual divine being might change mood, be placated, have second thoughts. A verdict endorsed by many, sealed by the assembly, is something else. It has weight. It feels impersonal, like a law of nature, but with a will behind it that you can neither predict nor confront. This is part of what made the Anunnaki so unnerving. They were not just a set of colourful characters with rival loves and grudges. They could appear as a block, a mass of judgment. In later texts from Assyria and Babylonia, this comes out especially in prayers of confession and lament. The speaker doesn't only address one god. They often invoke the gods, my lords, or the Anunnaki, the great gods. The anxiety is not just that a particular deity is angry. It's that all the gods might have turned their faces away together. And here another layer appears, the problem of not knowing what you have done. A striking refrain in many Mesopotamian prayers is the line, "The sin I have committed I do not know," or "The offence I have committed I do not know." The speaker lists categories. Perhaps I have neglected a ritual, spoken wrongly, touched what was taboo, but there is no precise charge sheet. Guilt is felt as a condition before it is understood as a specific act. Scholars debate exactly how to interpret this. Some see it as stock formula, a literary convention. Others read it as evidence of a genuine sense of ritual and moral uncertainty. Either way, the rhetoric is clear. You can be in trouble with the gods without understanding why. Impurity in this system is not always the result of conscious rebellion. You might have walked into a sacred space without proper cleansing. You might have broken an oath under duress. Someone in your household might have mishandled offerings, or a forgotten ancestral offence might still be echoing. When the gods deliberate, any of this could be placed on the cosmic scales. So prayers do not simply ask for blessings, they ask for clarification, for erasure of unknown charges. They beg the gods to untee the bond, loosen the sin, wipe away the transgression written on the tablet. The imagery is administrative, guilt as a file in a celestial archive, a record that can be pulled out in council and read aloud when your fate is being discussed. In such a world, being noticed is not always good news. Modern readers sometimes assume that divine attention is something you would always want, a sign of favour. Mesopotamian texts are more ambivalent. Of course, you want your personal god to look upon you in blessing. But you definitely do not want the assembled gods to suddenly fix their gaze on you as a problem to solve. Stories often turn on a fatal moment when humans attract the wrong kind of notice. Their noise, their numbers, their kingship building, their new city, these things come to the attention of the high gods. A particular king's arrogance might be reported to the assembly. A city's growing wealth might evoke jealousy or anger. It is not just that misfortune befalls you, it is that you have become a topic on the agenda. This anxiety filters down into everyday social life. Oaths, for example, are not just promises between humans. They are guaranteed by the gods. To swear falsely is to invite the divine council to act against you. Law codes and legal documents call on deities as witnesses, effectively pulling the Anunnaki into business contracts, property disputes, boundary markers. When a stone boundary inscription invokes a list of gods and threatens anyone who moves the marker with curse after curse, what it is really doing is this. It is asking that, someday, in some future assembly, the offender's name and act will be read out, and a verdict of punishment will be confirmed. Order in society, then, is not just backed by force. It is backed by the fear of invisible adjudication. Cosmic balance works the same way. In some Sumerian and Akkadian texts, the gods are described as maintaining measure, right order, the proper pattern of the world. When humans transgress, they are not merely breaking arbitrary rules. They are disturbing a balance that the gods themselves are responsible for upholding. If drought or invasion or plague come, it can be understood as the assembly's way of restoring that balance, harshly but effectively. This does not make the suffering easier. It does, however, frame it as the outcome of debate and decision, not blind chaos. For a person lying awake at night in a mud brick house, listening to the wind push dust against the roof, these imaginings had sharp emotional consequences. You were not just at the mercy of one god's temper. You lived under a structure of layered oversight. Your personal god, your family's deities, your city's patron, and, above all, the Anunnaki in their high council. Any of them might bring your case forward. Any of them might fail to defend you when your name was spoken. So piety became, in part, an attempt to secure representation in that unseen court. To have a god who would speak for you, to avoid, as far as possible, being cited as a case of disorder that needed to be corrected. In the next part, we'll narrow the focus from the assembly as a whole to the specific mechanism that made its decisions feel inescapable, the decrees of fate themselves, how they were imagined, and how their power defined the limits of what any human being could hope to control. When Mesopotamian texts talk about fate, they are not usually thinking in terms of vague fortune or random luck. They imagine something much more concrete, decrees, assignments, portions. The Sumerian word nam and the Akkadian word shimtu can both carry this sense. They can mean destiny, but also fixed decision, allotment, even what has been set down in writing. Fate is not an invisible force drifting through the universe. It is a verdict, a line on a cosmic document, a portion handed to you whether you like it or not. Myths describe the gods as literally holding the tablets of destinies. In some stories, a powerful god like Enlil or later Marduk possesses them. In others, an adversary briefly steals them, threatening to throw the whole system into chaos. Scholars debate whether these tablets were originally imagined as the decrees that kept the universe running, or more specifically as the authority to decide human and divine fates. The texts are not entirely consistent, but the underlying idea is clear enough. Fate is something recorded, authorized, sealed. Once a decree is fixed, it has a kind of terrifying solidity. Formulaic phrases emphasize this. A decision is not to be altered, not to be revoked, not to be changed by any god. Even other gods, in theory, are bound by the outcome of the council's deliberations. The Anunnaki do not only dispense fate, they also live inside the web of rules they have endorsed. From a human perspective, that makes the whole thing feel even more inescapable. You are not dealing with a moody superhuman who might wake up feeling generous tomorrow. You are dealing with a decision structure, a set of assignments that define your life in advance. Some texts talk about each person having a lot, a share in existence assigned by the gods. This lot can be favourable or harsh, long life or short, many children or few, prosperity or hardship. A king receives kingship as his allotted role. A farmer receives land and toil. A priest receives ritual duties. To some extent, this mirrors the rigid social hierarchy of Mesopotamian cities. But because the assignments are imagined as coming from the divine level, questioning them too bluntly risks, sounding like you are criticizing the gods themselves. And yet, people did not simply shrug and accept everything as immovably fixed. If they had, the massive ritual apparatus of Mesopotamian religion would make little sense. The logic seems to work like this. The decrees of fate exist, yes, but their boundaries are sometimes fuzzy. Their application can be delayed, softened, redirected. A death sentence can become merely an illness. A city's total destruction can become a temporary defeat. A personal curse can be lightened to a manageable burden. Myths and prayers hint that there is room at the edges of the system for negotiation. Ritual, in this context, is not a way of denying fate. It is a way of trying to work with it, around it, within it. If your name is already written on the tablets in some ominous way, you cannot simply erase it yourself. But perhaps a god who favours you can argue for an annotation, an amendment, a reprieve. This is where vow-making becomes important. Many prayers are framed as conditional promises. If a god will heal, rescue, or deliver the speaker, then the speaker will perform some act in return. If you let me live, one text essentially says, I will praise you before the people and bring you rich offerings. Another promises to sponsor a statue, a special ritual, a feast for the god. To modern ears, this can sound transactional, almost like bargaining at a market stall. But in the ancient context, it is less about haggling and more about relationship. A vow draws a line from your small, fragile life up into the divine sphere. It says, take note of me, invest in me. If you change the path of my fate, I will make it publicly visible that you are powerful and merciful. Supplication works on a similar principle, but with a different emotional tone. Laments often portray the supplicant as lying prone, weeping, begging the god to turn back a harsh decree. Sometimes they admit guilt, sometimes they emphasize confusion and helplessness. The goal is not to argue that the god was wrong. The goal is to move the god's heart, to awaken pity, to encourage a second look at whatever has been written. Appeasement rituals go one step further. Instead of just words, they involve material actions meant to absorb or deflect divine anger. Sacrifices, offerings, purification rites, the ritual transfer of evil onto an object or animal that can then be removed. The logic is again administrative and legalistic. If there is a charge against you in the celestial archive, perhaps it can be paid off or symbolically transferred, balancing the account. Kings participated in these strategies just as much as commoners, perhaps more. Official inscriptions show rulers boasting that the gods established their kingship from days of old, tying their authority directly to divine decree. But the same kings commissioned regular rituals to maintain or restore favour. They feared losing divine support because, in this worldview, a king without backing from the Anunnaki is not merely unpopular. He is illegitimate, vulnerable, already halfway to downfall. Historical chronicles often explain political disasters in these terms. A king is said to have neglected cultic duties, mistreated a temple, broken an oath. As a result, his protective deity abandons him. Enemies invade, cities fall, dynasties end. The military and economic factors are not denied, but they are framed as the outworking of a prior decision in the divine sphere. For ordinary people, the stakes were different in scale, but similar in kind. Your secure employment, your family's health, your harvest. These too could be signs that your allotted fate was currently favourable, that your personal god had not turned away. A sudden string of losses might be interpreted as evidence that some hidden decree had shifted against you, thus the pressure to keep up with daily piety. Small offerings at household altars, whispered prayers, careful observance of festivals and taboos. These were not just expressions of abstract reverence. They were attempts to maintain a channel of goodwill, to ensure that if your name came up in a divine discussion, some god would say, "This one honours me." Let us be gentle. Fear and reverence in this setting are not opposites. They are intertwined practices, To fear the gods is precisely to take them seriously enough to honour them, to assume that their decrees matter down to the level of your personal life. To revere them without fear, on the other hand, would be to miss the point. The texts rarely present worship as a purely joyful experience. It is charged with anxiety, obligation, hope, and dread all at once. You can see this tension especially clearly in rituals that ask the gods to change the verdict. The language is deferential. No one demands anything, but the request is bold. It implies that decrees, however fixed, can be revisited, not by human argument, but by divine mercy awakened through ritual attention. For someone lying awake at night in or Nippur, this left you with a complicated attitude toward the Anunnaki. On the one hand, they had assigned you your share of life. They had fixed the broad outlines of your destiny, set the limits of what you could control. On the other hand, they might still listen, might still be moved, might still lean over the tablets and in some unseen moment decide that your suffering had gone on long enough. The dread came from knowing that the final power was never yours. The fragile comfort came from believing that within that power there was at least a narrow path where your voice, your offerings, your vows could matter. In the next part, we'll turn from these invisible decrees to one of the most feared figures responsible for enforcing them. Enlil, lord of wind and storm, whose favour could make a city flourish, and whose anger could tear its fate to pieces overnight. Enlil's name sits near the top of the Mesopotamian divine hierarchy. In many Sumerian and early Akkadian traditions, he is not just one god among many, but the very embodiment of authority itself. If An is the distant sky, the abstract high god who often stays in the background, Enlil is the one whose decisions actually move history. Texts call him King of the Lands, Father of the Gods, the one who fixes destinies. In theory, that sounds reassuring. Someone is in charge. There is order, a central authority, a cosmic administrator who keeps everything from collapsing into chaos. But when you read the myths, a different emotional tone comes through. Enlil's authority is heavy, it is necessary, and also frightening. It can stabilize a kingdom for centuries. It can also, without much warning, sweep that kingdom off the map. One of the clearest examples is the flood story. In Sumerian and Akkadian versions, a group of gods grows annoyed with humanity's noise and disturbance. The chatter, the bustle, the endless building and breeding of humans rises up like an irritant. Different texts give slightly different motivations, but the basic problem is that human flourishing has crossed some invisible line. Enlil responds with an idea that is as simple as it is drastic. Wipe them out. Later redactions soften or redistribute the blame. Other gods question the decision. The wise god Enki Ea warns a human, Ziusudra or Napishtim, and helps him build an ark. In some versions, when the flood is over, the gods themselves are shown as hungry, desperate for offerings, clustering around the first post-flood sacrifice like flies. It is a kind of narrative critique. The destruction went too far, and even the gods suffered for it. But in the core structure of the story, Enlil is still the one whose wrath takes the form of total environmental catastrophe. The storm is not just weather, it is policy. For people living between the Tigris and Euphrates, that connection between divine mood and violent water was not abstract. Their world was shaped by rivers that could nourish or destroy, by storms that could mean life for the fields or sudden ruin. Irrigation agriculture in southern Mesopotamia depended on carefully managed canals. Too little water and crops failed. Too much water at the wrong time and dikes broke. Fields washed away, houses collapsed. Seasonal storms could rip across the plains with blinding dust and lashing rain. Thunder, wind and sudden floods were part of the annual rhythm, and also a constant low-level threat. When myths describe Enlil as the roaring storm, the howling wind, the one who makes the storm flood roar over the land, they are not reaching for random metaphors. They are mapping the unpredictable, often terrifying behavior of the environment onto a divine personality. The logic is intuitive. If the most powerful, least controllable forces you experience are wind and water, then the god who truly rules must be the god of wind and water. This makes Enlil's relationship with kingship especially loaded. City rulers routinely claimed that Enlil had called them to kingship, raised them to the throne, fixed their name in the office. In hymns, Enlil is praised as the one who puts the just crown on the head and makes the royal scepter radiant. The legitimacy of an entire dynasty could rest on this imagined moment of favour. Yet the same texts acknowledge that Enlil can revoke what he has given. Laments for destroyed cities tell of the day Enlil lifted his eyes against a place he once loved. Suddenly, the same god who had blessed its founder now decrees its ruin. Enemies are allowed in, canals are broken, famine and plague follow. The fall of Ur, the devastation of Nippur, the suffering of various city-states are framed as outworkings of Enlil's displeasure. The emotional pattern is consistent: initial favour, flourishing under his good wind, followed by a turning of that wind into a storm of judgment. From a human standpoint, this is unnerving. The most central god, the one tied directly to order and kingship, is also the one whose anger is most catastrophic. To be close to Enlil is to be exposed. Scholars sometimes talk about Enlil as a personification of state power, centralized authority projected into the heavens. In this reading, his ambivalence makes sense. A strong state can provide security, irrigation works, law courts. The same apparatus, if it turns hostile or collapses, can bring taxation, conscription, and large-scale disaster. Enlil is both the order that sustains and the authority that can crush. Other scholars emphasize the environmental dimension. The storm god's volatility mirrors the precarious ecology of the alluvial plain. Communities dependent on risky water management developed myths in which cosmic decisions could release or withhold rain, raise or lower flood levels. Enlil's moods in this view are a way of narrating the brutal randomness of climate and river behaviour. Neither reading cancels the other. Mesopotamian texts do not separate nature from politics the way modern categories often do. The king builds canals by the favour of Enlil. A failed harvest reflects both bad rainfall and bad divine relations. A city's destruction is at once a military defeat and a sign that Enlil changed his mind about it. Within this web of meaning, worshipping Enlil takes on a very particular character. On one level, it is gratitude. Hymns call him beneficent, shepherd, provider of abundance. They thank him for good harvests, stable rule, peace in the land. The image can be almost pastoral. Enlil as a kind of cosmic farmer tending the fields of humanity, with his winds bringing cool breezes and timely rain. On another level, it is risk management. If the most dangerous storms are expressions of divine displeasure, then ritual attention becomes a kind of early warning system and insurance policy. Temples to Enlil, especially in his cult centre at Nippur, were not just places of serene devotion. They were administrative hubs where offerings, songs, and elaborate ceremonies tried to keep the great lord's favour steady. For kings, piety toward Enlil was a matter of survival. Inscriptions boast that a ruler never neglected Enlil's rights, that he constantly provided for Enlil's table. Behind the boast is an anxiety. If the god who grants kingship turns away, your armies, your walls, your alliances will not save you. For ordinary people, the connection was less direct but still felt. If Enlil favoured the city, canals stayed in repair, trade moved, harvests came in. If rumours spread that Enlil was angry, that omens were bad, that priests were troubled, then every storm cloud could carry an extra charge of dread. And yet, the texts do not present Enlil as simply a villainous tyrant. In many hymns he is praised as wise, far-seeing, just. His decisions, however harsh, are portrayed as part of a larger order, not as random cruelty. When he agrees after the flood, that total annihilation was excessive. The solution is not to give up authority, but to refine it. Introduce limits on human population, new forms of control, alternative punishments short of global catastrophe. Some modern interpreters see in this a kind of mythic reflection on power, learning its own boundaries. Others caution against reading too much self-critique into the stories. The texts are doing many things at once, justifying existing structures, explaining suffering, expressing fear, and occasionally hinting that even the highest gods can reconsider. There is also the simple fact that people continued to love and praise Enlil for millennia. They did not abandon his cult as too frightening. Instead, they poured energy into keeping the relationship manageable. Rituals could address him directly, but they also often work through intermediaries, personal gods, priestly officials, other deities close to Enlil's circle. If you could not approach the storm head-on, perhaps you could speak to the winds on its edges, to the deities who might soften or interpret his decrees. In this sense, revering Enlil was less about adoring a comforting father figure and more about acknowledging a reality you could not afford to ignore. The storm exists, whether you like it or not. Better to learn its patterns, watch its signs, and offer what you can to keep it from breaking over your roof. As we move to Inanna, we will see a different kind of power, no less feared. Not the vast, impersonal storm that shatters cities, but the blazing intensity of desire and conflict, the goddess who brings both ecstasy and war. If Enlil embodies the dread of losing everything in a single cosmic decision, Inanna embodies the dread of being swept away by forces inside the heart and on the battlefield that feel just as uncontrollable. If Enlil is the storm you see coming over the horizon, Inanna is the lightning strike that comes out of a clear sky. In the oldest Sumerian texts, she is many things at once. Goddess of sexual attraction, of fertility, of passionate love. Also goddess of battle, of royal power, of the clash of armies. Later, Akkadian speakers call her Ishtar and intensify this fusion even further, where later religious traditions might separate love goddess and war god. Mesopotamia binds them inside one volatile, captivating figure. This is not a gentle Cupid, this is desire as a force that topples kings. Hymns to Inanna praise her as joy of heaven and earth, great light who fills the sky, but in the same breath call her the one who dances on the battlefield and she who lets there be bloodshed. One Sumerian poem says bluntly, she stirs up confusion and chaos. She loves the noise of battle. In love or in war, her energy is excessive, overflowing boundaries. That excess is part of what made her beloved, and part of what made her terrifying. Think about how ancient city life sharpened both erotic and violent tensions. Crowded streets, intertwined families, fragile honor. A marriage alliance could cement decades of peace between clans. One affair, one accusation of impropriety could set them at each other's throats. A king's passion for a particular consort might reshape court politics. A sudden infatuation could unbalance the careful gift exchange between families. In that world, desire is never just private, it is social dynamite. Inanna personifies that dynamite. Myths show her falling in love with Dumuzi, then turning on him in anger. She seduces, she exalts, she abandons. In one song, she showers Dumuzi with extravagant praise, promising him kingship and abundance. In another, during her descent to the underworld, she coolly designates him as the substitute who will die in her place. The emotional whiplash is striking. Ancient audiences did not have to be told what this meant. They lived in a world where alliances of love and kinship could flip into feud, where the same passion that united houses could tear them apart. Inanna's shifting moods gave that fear a divine face. The dread here is not only of being denied love, it is of being consumed by it. Some temple hymns celebrate Inanna's sacred sexuality in exuberant, almost triumphant terms, her body as a channel of fertility, her pleasure as a kind of blessing that makes fields yield grain and flocks multiply. Scholars often interpret these songs as part of royal ideology. The king unites with the goddess, symbolically to secure prosperity for the land. But that very imagery reveals anxieties. If the goddess's favour is erotic, intimate, then losing it is more than a political setback. It is like being spurned, shamed, left exposed. When texts describe Inanna turning her heart elsewhere, it can imply not just a shift of divine support, but the humiliation of abandonment. Honour is at stake, and in this culture, honour is never only personal. A king's perceived intimacy with Inanna reflects on his whole city. If she favours another, your enemies can claim she has turned her eyes to them instead. Temples amplify this tension. They are stages where priests and kings must act out devotion convincingly enough to keep the goddess's dangerously intense attention on their side. Her warlike side magnifies all of this. By the Old Akkadian and Old Babylonian periods, Ishtar is explicitly called Lady of Battle, crusher of enemies, the one who goes before kings. Soldiers carry her symbols. Kings boast that she marched at their right hand in war. A famous Assyrian king, centuries later, will inscribe that Ishtar broke their bows, smashed their chariots, struck down their warriors on his behalf. Yet the same traditions admit that she is not reliably on anyone's side. In one text, Ishtar pushes a king to attack, promising victory only for the campaign to dissolve into disaster. In another, she abandons a city on the eve of its fall, described as leaving the temple like a lover leaving a house. The implication is chilling. The goddess of love can also be the lover who walks away just before catastrophe hits. Scholars disagree on how much of this is deliberate political commentary, and how much is simply story logic, but the emotional pattern is consistent. Inanna's martial enthusiasm is glorious when directed outward, toward your enemies. It is horrifying when it turns or falters, when her appetite for conflict empties itself on your own walls. There is a deeper social resonance here, for communities that depended on young men going to war. The line between honour and annihilation was thin. A successful campaign could mean loot, prestige, new lands. A failed one meant dead sons, widowed wives, impoverished parents. Ishtar's delight in battle mirrors the intoxicating allure of military glory and the queasy awareness that this same thrill feeds on real bodies. So, devotion to Inanna Ishtar often sounds like a negotiation with a dangerous ally. Hymns beg her to stand by the king in battle, to hold his hand and go before him like a raging storm against foreign armies. But there are also prayers asking her to calm down, to let strife and quarrel be far away, to turn her blazing anger away from the supplicant's own house. The same goddess who is invoked to inflame courage and desire is also asked to restrain herself, to sheathe her weapons and cool her heart. In this way, her cult reveals something important about how the Mesopotamians saw their own vulnerabilities. They did not imagine themselves only as victims of external forces, floods, famines, invading armies. They also felt threatened by their own impulses: envy, lust, the desperate hunger for status, the thrill of revenge. Inanna is the divine mirror of those inner storms. Worshipping her means asking for the power to wield passion without being destroyed by it. In personal prayers, Ishtar appears as a kind of patroness of the desperate. People appeal to her in sickness, in legal troubles, in romantic misery. They call her compassionate, a saviour, the merciful goddess who hears the lament. But the language is rarely calm. It is the language of someone clinging to a wild, bright force, hoping it will break their chains and not break them. The differences between earlier Sumerian Inanna and later Akkadian Babylonian Ishtar, are subtle but telling. In early Sumerian hymns, Inanna is closely tied to specific cities, to the sacred marriage ritual, to agricultural fertility, as well as to war. Her myths explore cosmic roles, her taking of the me, the powers of civilization, her dangerous journey to the underworld, her confrontations with other gods. She is disruptive, but also a principle of creative renewal. As Mesopotamian empires rise and expand, the Akkadian Ishtar becomes more explicitly imperial and martial. She is associated with Venus, the morning and evening star, brilliant, beautiful, appearing and disappearing suddenly. Her connection with kingship is increasingly militarized. In Assyrian and Babylonian royal inscriptions, Ishtar's sexuality and ferocity blend into a portrait of a goddess who both seduces and terrifies enemies, who roars like a lioness on the battlefield. Modern scholars see different emphases. Some highlight her as a symbol of female agency and power, a figure who crosses boundaries and refuses confinement. Others stress how her volatility reflects cultural unease about sexuality, gender roles, and the costs of war. The texts themselves do not resolve these tensions. They hold them together inside one name. For ancient worshippers, this meant that approaching Inanna or Ishtar was never simple adoration. It was courting a power that could lift you into ecstasy or throw you into ruin. The dread she inspired was not the cold fear of a distant judge, but the hot, breathless fear of being too close to a fire that both warms and burns. If Enlil made people afraid of sudden storms and overturned kingdoms, Inanna made them afraid of the moment when their own heart, their own army, their own longing would surge beyond control. To live under her gaze was to know that the most dangerous forces may not come from the sky above, but from the desires and conflicts that rise within and between human beings themselves. And if such energies could belong to a goddess, they could also belong to the shadows beneath the earth. For the Mesopotamians, the dread of divine power did not stop at the surface. It extended downward into the realm where the dead gathered and other Anunnaki sat in judgment below. For the people of ancient Mesopotamia, there was no bright meadow waiting after death, no shining paradise where the righteous were rewarded and the wicked were punished. There was simply below. The underworld had many names across languages and periods: Ker, Akala, the land of no return. But whatever they called it, the basic picture was bleakly consistent. You went down, you didn't come back, and almost nothing about that place sounded comforting. One Sumerian text calls it the house whose entrants never leave, the road from which there is no coming back. The dead eat dust, drink muddy water. Their bodies are gone, they exist as pale, fragile ghosts, dependent on whatever offerings the living send down to them. There is no clear moral sorting. Kings, slaves, warriors, children, everyone shares the same dim, cramped estate. This alone makes the Mesopotamian afterlife feel very different from later religious systems many of us are familiar with. It is not a place you hope to enter. It is a place you know you cannot avoid. And the Anunnaki are there. In the earliest Sumerian traditions, Anunnaki can mean a broad group of high gods, the Great Assembly, children of Anu. But as centuries pass, some texts start to use the name more specifically for deities of the underworld, divine figures who sit in judgment over the dead. The exact roster changes. The sources are messy and sometimes fragmentary. In one hymn, the Anunnaki are celestial deities who decree fates from heaven. In another, they are explicitly listed as underworld judges, seated with Ereshkigal in the depths. Scholars debate whether this is a real shift in how people thought about them, or just different local traditions overlapping on clay tablets. What is clear is the role they play in certain myths and incantations. They are the authorities of below. When Inanna descends to the underworld in one famous Sumerian myth, she passes through 7 gates, stripped of her symbols of power, until she stands naked before the throne of Ereshkigal. Around that throne sit the Anunnaki of the underworld. The text says they fastened their eyes upon her, that they pronounced the judgment against her and turned her into a corpse, hanging her on a hook. It's a strange scene. A living goddess is treated like one of the dead. She is judged not by a single stern ruler, but by a council. No long speeches, no elaborate moral trial, just a kind of implacable procedure. You arrived, they looked, they decided, you joined the dead. Later Akkadian texts speak of the 7 judges of the underworld, sometimes equating them with Anunnaki who sit on thrones in the dark, recording and confirming fates. Whether we should imagine 7 specific named gods, or a more symbolic committee, is not entirely clear. The sources don't lay it out neatly, but the mood is unmistakable, fateful, bureaucratic, beyond appeal. This bureaucracy of death is part of what made them so unsettling. In life you might bargain with the gods. You could pray, make offerings, perform rituals, try to sway Enlil or Inanna or your personal deity. There was wiggle room. There were omens, second chances, possibilities of forgiveness. In the underworld, not so much. Descriptions of the Great Gate and the registrar gods who stand by it make the whole thing sound like a cosmic office. There are tablets where your name is written. There are door bolts and seals and doorkeepers with fixed duties. When Anunnaki in underworld mode are mentioned, they resemble magistrates more than warriors, functionaries making sure that what has been decreed is carried out, that no soul slips back upward without authorization. Death here is not dramatic justice with trumpets. It is administration, and that is a particular kind of dread. A capricious storm god might, on a good day, change his mind. A fiery love goddess might be coaxed, flattered, seduced into mercy. But the judges below, they are not passionate, they are proper. They are the system. To live with that vision is to feel that the most terrifying thing about death is not torment, but certainty. Everyone will go there. The only real variables are, how will you get there, and what happens to your ghost once you've arrived? This is where the fear of neglect enters. Because although the underworld is largely the same for all, Mesopotamian texts are very clear about one distinction: ghosts with descendants who care for them, and ghosts without. The dead needed offerings. Clay tablets describe the kisbu, the regular ritual meal for the ancestors, bread, beer, sometimes other foods, set out so that the dead will not starve in the dust. We should be careful not to over-systematize. Practices probably differed by city and by era, but the idea that the dead depend on the living is consistent across a long stretch of time. If no one pours water for you, you wander thirsty. If no one leaves bread, your ghost is hungry, weakened, frustrated. And hungry, frustrated ghosts are dangerous. Many incantations and exorcistic texts speak of restless dead who haunt the living, those who died violently, those improperly buried, those who have no one to care for them. These ghosts can cause illness, nightmares, misfortune. They are not merely sad, they are agents of harm. Failure in your obligations to the dead thus had a double edge. On one side, you doom your ancestor or relative to a more miserable existence in the underworld. On the other, you risk that same neglected spirit lashing out, with the approval or at least the tolerance of the powers below. In some prayers and rituals, the Anunnaki of the underworld are invoked specifically to restrain or redirect such ghosts, to accept offerings on their behalf, to take the hand of the troubled spirit and keep it in its proper place. Again, the exact formulas vary, and scholars argue over how standardized the notion of underworld courts really was. But the picture that emerges is of a layered chain of responsibility. The living must feed the dead. The Anunnaki must oversee the dead. If either link fails, something goes wrong. Imagine what that does to daily life. Your obligations don't end when someone dies. In a sense, they intensify. You're responsible for their continued miserable but stable existence. Neglect is not only guilt, it's danger. Forgetting an offering, skipping a ritual, mishandling a burial, any of these could upset the delicate balance, turn a quiet ghost into an active threat. And always behind this are the judges below, the Anunnaki who enforce the rules of the place you will eventually join. Unlike some later ideas of hell, there is very little moral consolation here. You don't get the satisfaction of imagining your enemies writhing in flames while you sit in bliss. They go down like you do. They eat dust like you do. The same underworld administration processes everyone. This moral flatness makes the whole system feel even more relentless. When some late texts hint at special fates for exceptionally evil or unburied individuals, they stand out precisely because they are exceptions. The core expectation remains the land of no return, the house of dust, watched over by the Anunnaki, who record and ratify what has already been decided. So the dread of these gods is unlike the fear of a sudden storm or a volatile passion. It is the slow, grinding awareness that there is an order to the universe that will outlast you, that will eventually absorb you, and that cares more about procedure than about your personal story. You could wake up to find Inanna's favour gone, Enlil's storm upon your city, your fortunes reversed overnight. But there was one fate that never reversed, one direction that never changed, downward, and at the bottom of that path in a shadowy hall that everyone would someday enter, the Anunnaki sat in their silent assembly not to be adored, but to make sure that what was written on the great tablets of destiny stayed that way. From there, it was a small step in the Mesopotamian imagination to link sickness, demons, and divine punishment with the same machinery of fate. If the underworld ran on rules, then perhaps the invisible miseries of life were also part of those decrees, dispatched from the same unseen offices that waited in the dark below. If death was a matter of procedure, sickness was its advance notice. In the Mesopotamian way of thinking, there was very little that just happened. A fever was not simply a biological event. A sudden stabbing pain was not merely random. When your child wouldn't stop crying, when your father began wasting away, when you woke up with half your face paralyzed, these were not neutral facts. They were messages. And the first question wasn't, which organ is failing? It was, who did this? The range of possible answers was wide. A god might be offended. Maybe you had broken an oath, slighted a ritual, mismanaged an offering. Maybe you had unknowingly stepped on consecrated ground in muddy sandals. Maybe your city as a whole had drifted from proper worship, and the god of your temple was signalling displeasure through the most intimate medium available, your body. Or perhaps it wasn't a great god at all. Perhaps it was something smaller and closer. A demon. The Akkadian word often translated demon is Remu, or sometimes Utuku or Lilu. These terms don't map cleanly onto later ideas of horned devils or purely evil spirits. Mesopotamian demons are more like forces, sometimes personified, that inhabit the gaps between human and divine. They can be nameless, or they can have specific titles and functions: the demon of the south wind, the one who prowls at noon, the one who strangles sleepers at night. Some texts treat them like independent beings with personalities. Others make them feel more like job descriptions, positions in a terrifying bureaucracy. The one who brings headaches, the one who afflicts the chest, the one who prowls for infants. In any case, if you fell ill, you lived in a world where such agents were assumed. There is a whole class of texts often called diagnostic omens that look eerily like medical manuals, listing symptoms in careful order. But again and again, they end not with a physiological explanation, but with an attribution. The hand of the god so-and-so, the approach of a ghost, the seizure of a demon. To be sick was to be caught in someone's hand. This is where the figure of the exorcist enters, standing uneasily between priest, magician, and therapist. The Akkadian term is ashipu. He was trained in vast series of incantations, ritual procedures, and omen texts. He knew which syllables to whisper to turn aside the demon of the fever, which plants to burn so that their smoke would offend the ghost that had lodged in your house, which miniature figurines to bury under the threshold to divert wandering harm. We shouldn't imagine him as a stage performer throwing holy water dramatically. His work was methodical, almost administrative. If you came to him saying, "My head hurts, my eyes burn, I cannot sleep," he would consult tablets, match symptom to text, and then try to trace a chain of cause and responsibility. Is this the punishment of Shamash, the sun god, for some broken legal oath? Is it the grasp of a dead relative who has been neglected? Is it the work of Lamashtu, a feared demoness thought to attack mothers and infants? Or is it simply the evil tongue of someone who cursed you? The answer mattered, because the cure wasn't just a matter of herbs. It was a matter of relationship. If a god was angry, you might need confession and offerings. If a demon had seized you, you might need expulsion, incantations to loosen the hand that had closed around your body. If a ghost was involved, you might need to perform the kispu meal, sending bread and beer to the underworld to pacify the offended dead. All of this took place under a constant pressure, the anxiety of not knowing. Most people did not read cuneiform. They did not have the Omen series memorized. They knew instead the feeling of helplessness when illness struck without warning and would not recede. To live in this world was to feel that somewhere, some rule had been broken, some being displeased, and that you needed a specialist to tell you which one. Even the language is revealing. To call an illness the hand of a god is to picture yourself physically gripped, held, pressed down. The exorcist's goal was to pry those fingers open, through words, through gesture, through the careful application of substances with their own symbolic weight. Incantations could be long, elaborate poems, invoking not just one power but chains of them. You might appeal to a higher god to restrain a lower demon, or even to the Anunnaki of the underworld to call back a ghost that had overstepped its bounds. The spiritual ecosystem was dense, hierarchical, and full of overlapping jurisdictions. And here is where the line between god and demon starts to blur. In some incantations, demons are explicitly sent by gods. They are not rogue entities acting on their own, but dispatched instruments of wrath. In other texts, lesser deities act in ways that, functionally, are indistinguishable from demons, striking people with diseases, haunting households, attaching themselves to particular families until properly appeased. Conversely, both gods and demons can be talked away, appeased, diverted. You might wear a small amulet inscribed with the name or image of a protective deity. Pazuzu, for instance, a demon-like figure who, in some periods, is invoked not as an afflictor, but as a protector against other, worse forces. You might hang a plaque over your bed with a short formula, warding off Lamashtu. You might bury tiny clay dogs at the four corners of your house, associated with the god Gula, patroness of healing, to guard your thresholds against intruders, both human and unseen. These objects were not fashion. They were technologies of fear management. If a demon could ride the wind into your house, an amulet could stand at the door. If a god's anger could manifest as a persistent stomach pain, a properly performed ritual could, in theory, demonstrate remorse and secure relief. The whole system runs on the underlying assumption that invisible beings are responsive to signs, gifts, words, gestures, symbolic actions, yet the responsiveness cuts both ways. Because if failure to perform these actions might lead to affliction, then every skipped ritual becomes a risk. Forget to renew the protective amulet? Perhaps that is why your child's cough is not going away. Miss the monthly offering to your personal god? Perhaps that is why your business has started to fail and your joints ache. There is a constant background noise of potential blame. This is not simply superstition in the modern pejorative sense. It is a coherent worldview in which causality is thick with intention. Nothing is merely accidental. It is always also a sign. And that makes everyday life a negotiation. Before a journey, you might have your household exorcist recite protective formulas over your body, trace water over your head, give you a small tablet to wear around your neck. Before a major business agreement, you might worry not just about the other party's honesty, but about whether a malicious curse has been spoken over the contract. Before childbirth, you might call in women specialized in apotropaic rituals, spreading amulets around the birthing room like a fence of prayers. Each act is aimed at reducing uncertainty in a world where the most terrifying thing is not pain itself, but the sense that you don't know who has written it into your fate. And always somewhere in the background is the underworld bureaucracy we've already met. The same tablets that record destinies, the same judges who oversee ghosts, are imagined in some texts as approving or transmitting afflictions as part of those destinies. Illness is not just a random invasion, it is an item on a cosmic ledger. So daily fear doesn't simply lead to panic. It leads to practice, to muttered prayers before stepping out the door, to routine offerings at family altars, to small, almost automatic gestures, touching an amulet, reciting a short formula whenever something feels slightly off, to the regular consulting of exorcists, not only when disaster strikes but in hopes of preventing it. In this way, dread becomes a kind of constant, low-level companion, not the blinding terror of a single catastrophe, but the quiet, persistent awareness that your body, your house, your children are all potential sites of negotiation between you and powers you cannot see, cannot fully understand, and cannot permanently satisfy. From here, it is not a huge leap to imagine that those powers might also speak through other channels, through the flight of birds, the pattern of oil on water, the appearance of an eclipse. If illness can be a message, perhaps the sky itself can talk. And in Mesopotamia it did. Once you accept that the gods can speak through your body, it is only a small step to believing they can speak through anything. The sky, the river, the womb, the stable, the way smoke curls, the way a dog barks in the night, the strange dream that will not leave you in the morning. Mesopotamian culture developed an entire industry around this assumption. We call it omen science. They would have called it simply wisdom. The basic idea is simple enough. The gods, the Anunnaki, the whole invisible hierarchy we've been tracing are not silent. They issue signs. Those signs can be read. If you are clever, trained, attentive enough, you can see the warning before the blow lands. In practice it becomes overwhelming. Look up at the night sky. For you and me, it is a scattering of stars, maybe a reminder to feel small and poetic. For a trained Mesopotamian diviner, the Baru, it was a text, planets wandering among fixed stars, the sudden bite of an eclipse tearing into the full moon, a reddish tinge to Mars, a halo around the sun. Each variation, each deviation from what was remembered as normal, belonged somewhere in a vast mental catalogue of precedents. If the moon is eclipsed on the 14th day and its shadow falls toward the west, the king of Akkad will face rebellion. If a halo surrounds the sun and Jupiter stands within it, prosperity will come to the land. The wording varies, the details change, but the logic is consistent. Something unusual happens above, something corresponding will happen below. As above, so below, long before that phrase became popular in other traditions. It is quietly assumed on clay tablets in Sumer and Akkad. And it isn't only the sky. Strange births were watched closely. A lamb born with 2 heads, a calf with 6 legs, a baby whose fingers were fused, whose eyes were cloudy at birth. These were not treated as genetic accidents. They were portents. The uterus had become a message board, the same held for the world of animals and everyday phenomena. A swallow building a nest on the wrong side of a house. a snake crossing your path in a certain direction, the pattern that congealed when oil was poured into water, the odd way a fire flickered during a ritual. Even dreams were texts to be decoded. There are lengthy lists of dream omens. If a man dreams he is flying, good fortune. If he dreams that his house collapses, the death of someone in that household. These are presented like reference manuals. You dream, you report. Someone matches your interior image to an established entry. On one level, this is reassuring. If everything is potentially meaningful, then nothing is purely arbitrary. Sudden disaster is rarely without warning. You simply fail to read the signs. Knowledge becomes a shield. The more tablets you memorize, the more precedents you know, the safer you might be. At least, that is the promise. But the more you widen the field of possible messages, the more chances you have to see looming catastrophe everywhere. Because the signs were not gentle, a surprising number of omens, especially celestial ones, predict misfortune, the fall of a king, the invasion of a land, famine, plague, the drying up of rivers, the appearance of hostile armies. An eclipse in particular was almost never good news. You can imagine the atmosphere. The court diviner sees the calculations. The moon will be eaten next month. It will darken at a particular segment of its path, over a particular horizon. According to the tablets, that configuration has been seen before, and when it was seen, the king of that earlier time died. Now what? This is where omen science shades into omen management. Some of the most famous Mesopotamian rituals are not for predicting but for deflecting. If an eclipse threatens the king's life, you can, in theory, fool the omen. For the duration of the eclipse, a substitute king might be placed on the throne, some unfortunate man, treated royally for a few days, clothed in fine garments, given meals and attendance. The gods, it is hoped, will take him instead. At the end of the ritual period, the substitute is killed. The doom of the omen has been fulfilled. The real king resumes his seat, anxious but alive. This sounds cruel, even theatrical to us. But it shows how seriously these signs were taken. An ominous configuration in the sky was a threat not just to one man's life, but to the legitimacy of an entire regime. If the gods have marked the king for death, maybe they have withdrawn their favour. Maybe they intend someone else to rule, so rulers invested heavily in omen experts. Astrologer priests watched the sky from palace roofs. Haruspices, specialists in liver omens, stood ready to inspect the entrails of sacrificed sheep. Scholars maintained huge libraries of omen series, hundreds of clay tablets covered in tiny cuneiform script, collecting generations of observations. The liver omens are particularly striking. The idea is this: the liver of a sacrificial animal is a mirror of the cosmos. It is soft, malleable, and thought to be the seat of life. When a king faced a big decision going to war, starting a building project, making a major treaty, he could order a sheep sacrificed. The diviner would examine the liver with almost forensic attention. Is there a mark on the gate section? Is a particular lobe unusually shaped? Are there bumps or fissures in certain zones? Each feature, each irregularity, corresponds to a written omen. If the throne is split, the enemy king will fall, and so on. It is tempting to see all this as pure control fantasy, the attempt of a small elite to force the gods to speak on demand. But the texts themselves are more ambiguous. Many omen series are written in a dry, almost bureaucratic tone. They are not spells to compel, they are catalogues of what has been seen and what happened afterward. Often they simply say, if X, then Y. They do not tell you how to change Y. They only identify it. In other words, divination provided clarity, not always comfort. To know that a bad sign has appeared is to know that misfortune is on its way. But in many cases, the tablets offer no easy remedy. There might be appeasement rituals, offerings you can make, prayers you can recite. yet the basic sense remains: something has been written. In Mesopotamian terms, the decrees of the gods, those terrifying tablets of destinies, are not casually overwritten. Omen reading is less like editing the text and more like getting an advance copy. This produces a peculiar tension. On the one hand, there is a genuine belief in agency. You consult the diviner to decide whether to march an army, to plant in this field rather than that one, to trust this vassal or that ally. A favourable omen can embolden a hesitant king. An unfavourable one can stop a reckless decision before it becomes catastrophe. On the other hand, the more precise the system becomes, the more it suggests that outcomes are already embedded in the fabric of things. The gods are not improvising. They are releasing what was long decreed, and the signs are the shadows those decrees cast before them. For a ruler, this is double-edged dread. You fear missing the sign, making a choice in ignorance that offends the gods or accelerates your fall. But you also fear seeing the sign clearly and realizing that your fall is inevitable, no matter what you do. Modern scholars sometimes compare these omen compendia to early scientific handbooks. There is pattern recognition, systematic recording of data, attempts at correlation. Over generations, Mesopotamian scholars turned random-seeming events into a structured language. Yet unlike modern science, which often aims at explanation and control, omen science remains entangled with fate. To read a sign correctly is to align yourself with what is coming, not necessarily to avert it. The very act of opening the tablet chest, of consulting the series, is an acknowledgement. I am already inside the story the gods are telling. Let me at least know my lines. For ordinary people, far from palace roofs and royal livers, this filtered down as a constant low hum of anxiety. A strange dog howls at your door at midnight. A child is born with an unusual mark. A neighbour dreams of a flooded city. You do not have the tablets, but you know enough to feel a chill. Somewhere someone should be consulted. Somewhere there is a line that matches this moment, assigning it its share of good or ill. So omens did what illness and demons and underworld judges already did. They filled the space of uncertainty. But instead of closing that space with comfort, they filled it with words, with predictions, with the sense that messages are always arriving, whether you want them or not. And if the world itself is always talking, then the burden shifts to you. Will you hear? Will you understand? And what will you do when understanding brings not relief, but the realization that you are small, and watched, and woven into patterns you did not choose? That is the emotional climate in which temples rise, offerings pile up, and rituals proliferate, each one another attempt to negotiate with a cosmos that never stops sending messages and never fully explains its terms. By the time you walk up the steps of a Mesopotamian temple in your imagination, you are already carrying all of that with you. The omens, the demons, the judges below, the storms of Enlil and the moods of Inanna. The sense that everything matters, and that you almost never know exactly how. The temple is where you go to try. To a modern visitor, the great temples of Mesopotamia can look like places of refuge. High terraces, towering ziggurats, enclosed courtyards that rise above the flat mud-brick towns. You might imagine quiet chanting, incense, soft light, a space set apart from the chaos of daily life. But in their own time, these were not peaceful monasteries. They were the beating, grinding, endlessly busy hearts of the city. A temple was an economic engine. Fields, herds, workshops, granaries, scribal schools, all could be attached to a major sanctuary. Land was dedicated to the god. Its produce, in theory, belonged to the god. In practice, that meant to the temple institution and the layers of priests, workers, and administrators who served there. Clay tablets from places like Ur and Nippur read like office paperwork, delivery notices for barley, inventories of sheep, wage lists for weavers and porters. The goddess owns hundreds of sheep. The god owns a brewery. The temple hires men to clean canals or harvest reeds. Somewhere in all this, a deity is being fed, because that was the core idea. The gods had houses. Those houses had kitchens. The gods ate there. At the centre of the temple, beyond the courtyards and side rooms, was the innermost shrine, the Holy of Holies. There stood the statue of the god or goddess, wood, covered in gold leaf, inlaid with precious stones, dressed in fine garments. This was not a symbol in the abstract way we might think. This was the god's physical presence in the city. You washed the statue, you anointed it with oils, you put jewelry on it, you made its bed, you sang to it in the morning and in the evening, and you brought food. Every day, multiple times a day in large cities, offerings were prepared in the temple kitchens: bread, beer, meat, fruit, dairy. These were laid out on tables before the statue. Incantations were recited to invite the god to partake of the essence of the food. Afterward, the physical meal was distributed, consumed by priests, redistributed to workers, sometimes given to the poor. From a modern distance that can look transactional, you feed the god protects the city. But for people living inside this system, it was closer to a binding contract that could not be allowed to lapse. The god is not a guest you entertain when you feel like it. The god is the landlord. The city is built on divine property. The people, in one theological strand, are literally created to take over the heavy labour the junior gods no longer wanted to do. If the landlord is neglected, the lease is not simply up for renegotiation. The landlord might burn the building down. So the temple's ritual life is relentless. Morning offerings, evening offerings, monthly festivals keyed to the moon, annual festivals timed to harvest and planting cycles, special rites when an omen appears, when a plague breaks out, when the king goes to war. Each of these has a script, words to be spoken, gestures to be made, items to be handled in a specific sequence. There are washing rites, fumigations with incense, precise numbers of prostrations. There are rules about which hand holds the libation vessel, which direction you face, how many times the drum is struck. This is where the anxiety creeps in, because it is not enough to do the ritual. You must do it correctly. Many texts stress purity. Before entering certain parts of the temple, you must be clean in body and in status. Sexual abstinence for a set period. No contact with corpses. No eating taboo foods. No physical blemishes that might displease the god's gaze. A priest who has had contact with death may have to undergo purifications and wait days before approaching the inner room. A singer who mispronounces a sacred name can be ritually blamed for the god's displeasure. An improperly baked bread, a smudged cuneiform sign in a prayer, a vessel set on the wrong side of the altar, these are not small mistakes. They are breaches, and in a world where drought and war and disease are always near, any breach is dangerous. If the crops fail, someone will ask, who angered the god? If the river floods too high, if enemies suddenly break through the city walls, if a plague rips through the households of the elite, the question is not only what happened, but what was done wrong. The priesthood's role is shaped by this pressure. On one level, they are specialists, astronomer priests reading the sky, diviners reading livers, lamentation priests chanting long, intricate hymns, purification priests learning the recipes for incense and washings. They train for years to memorize the words and gestures that have been handed down. On another level, they are managers of cosmic risk. Their job is not to feel pious. Their job is to keep the temple functioning as it should, so that the god's anger does not flare. They become, in effect, professional warriors on behalf of the community. Tablets preserve lists of ritual mistakes and the corrective actions to take, as if the universe has a fault reporting system and you must file the right form on time. The precision is not mere fussiness. It is a way of drawing a sharp line between "we did everything required" and "we failed." If disaster still comes after the liturgy has been executed flawlessly, then the cause must lie elsewhere, perhaps in some hidden sin, some royal offence, some destiny long ago written. That doesn't reduce the fear, it relocates it. But the rituals at least give you something to hold. For ordinary people, the temple also structures daily life through offerings and obligations. A farmer brings part of his harvest as a tithe to the god. A merchant vows a gift if his caravan returns safely. A family dedicates a small statue or inscribed plaque in gratitude for recovery from illness. These acts are not only private gestures, they are visible, recorded, socially remembered. Everyone knows that the god of the city has done much for you. Everyone sees whether you reciprocate. Failure to show up with your share does not only risk the god's displeasure, it risks your neighbour's judgment. To be stingy toward the divine is to be unreliable toward the community. If the god protects the city, and you're not doing your part to keep the god fed and honoured, then you have become a point of weakness in the collective defence. Reverence in this setting is inseparable from obligation. You fear the god because of storms and plagues, yes, but you also fear being known as the one who cuts corners on offerings, who skips festival days, who desecrates purity rules. The god's gaze and society's gaze reinforce each other until it is hard to tell where one ends and the other begins. In the hymns, temples are described as places of joy, where music plays and the god's presence blesses the land. And no doubt, on festival days with the city gathered, the streets decorated, the statues paraded, and the kitchens overflowing, many people felt genuine celebration. But under that joy runs a current of tension. Have we brought enough? Did we speak correctly? Did we forget any of the old formulas? Has the king offended some deity in a way we cannot see? In a cosmos ruled by decrees you cannot read directly, temples and offerings are not simple comforts. They are ongoing negotiations with power, written in barley and blood and breath. Each loaf placed on the table, each libation poured, each careful word of a priest is both a plea and a promise. We have not forgotten you. Do not forget us. And yet, the history of Mesopotamia is a long record of cities sacked, sanctuaries burned, divine statues carried off by conquerors. The offerings did not always work. The dread was not misplaced. Which is why, when things go wrong on a massive scale, when temples themselves fall and gods seem to have turned their faces away, the Mesopotamians reach for another genre entirely. The long, aching laments and prayers that try to speak into divine anger after the fact. If the temple is the god's house, the palace is the god's experiment. From the point of view of Mesopotamian thought, kingship is not something human beings invent because they feel like organizing themselves. It is something that descends. Some of the oldest Sumerian texts put it simply, then kingship descended from heaven. It is described almost like an object, a power, a pattern that falls from the divine sphere to the human world, first to one city, then after disaster, flood, conquest to another. A city does not just crown a king. The gods establish his name, raise his head, take him by the hand. Without that, he is just a man with troops. With it, he is the point where heaven and earth are supposed to meet. But because kingship comes from the gods, it is also always on loan. The same texts that talk about kingship descending also talk about it being uprooted, taken away, causing the throne to be overturned. When a dynasty collapses, when invaders pour through the gates, the explanation given in royal inscriptions and laments is rarely that the king was outnumbered or unlucky. It is that the gods changed their minds. Again and again on clay tablets, you see the same language. Enlil grew angry with his city. The gods abandoned the sanctuary. My lord Marduk turned his face away from his people. After this comes the list of consequences: walls breached, palaces burned, people carried off into slavery. The logic is brutal. If the god withdraws favour, the king's power evaporates. If the god decides the city's kingship should be transferred elsewhere, no human effort can permanently stop it. Victory and defeat, rise and fall, all become visible signs of hidden divine decisions. Kings wrote this logic into their own propaganda, and you can feel the anxiety just under the surface. On the one hand, royal inscriptions are full of confidence. By the command of Anu and Enlil, I smote my enemies. Nana, my king, gave me their lands. Kings list cities conquered, canals dug, temples restored, presenting themselves as the arm of divine will. On the other hand, that very claim is dangerous. If you say, "Everything I do is by the word of the gods," then every setback raises a terrifying question. What word is being spoken now? So, in the same inscriptions, often within the same lines, you find elaborate performances of humility. A king calls himself the humble shepherd, the one who is constantly praying, the one who fears the word of his God. He is the servant who holds the hem of the god's garment, the little one who always obeys. He boasts of his building projects, then immediately insists that he did it in reverence without neglecting the rites, according to what the ancient tablets prescribed. He must appear powerful to his subjects and enemies, but pious and small before the divine. It is a balancing act written in wet clay. War is where this tension becomes most acute. Going to war, especially offensive war, is the moment a king most needs the gods to be visibly on his side. He cannot simply march out with an army. He must be seen to seek approval. Texts describe kings consulting oracles, performing liver divination, making special offerings before campaigns. If the omens are favourable, they proclaim it, "Shamash has given me the sign." If a battle is won, the credit flows upward. By the exalted command of Ishtar, I trampled them like clay. If a battle is lost, or if the enemy triumphs for a time, it is never publicly because of tactical failure. It is because the days of that city's kingship were fulfilled. The god gave its rule into the hand of another. That thought hangs constantly over the throne. Your crown exists at the pleasure of beings whose motives you can only guess at from storms and liver spots and the tilt of smoke. So kings live in ritual, not just in war but all the time. Coronation itself is staged as a kind of adoption. In Babylon, the new king would in later periods be led by the hand of Marduk's statue, physically dramatizing that his authority comes from the god's grip. In other cities, kings took the hands of Enlil or Shamash, or stood before Inanna's shrine, swearing oaths. Year after year, great festivals reenact this transfer of power. In the New Year rites of Babylon, the king is ritually humiliated, stripped of regalia, slapped by a priest, made to swear that he has not abused his rule. If he weeps, if the god's image accepts his plea, it is a sign the god still approves. If not, everyone knows what that would mean. Historically, these rituals evolve and change, and scholars debate exactly how they were performed in different eras. But the consistent theme is clear. The king must show that he remembers where the kingship came from, and that he knows it can be taken back. Publicly, this humility is not only about the god, it is also a message to people when a king proclaims, "Anu and Enlil gave me the kingship over all lands." It reinforces obedience. To rebel is not just to oppose a man, it is to push against the cosmic order. To disobey the royal edict is, in the rhetoric of these texts, to transgress the command of the god. The dread of divine punishment becomes a political tool. Law codes are attributed to gods, Shamash giving laws to Hammurabi, for example. At the top of the stele, the king stands or kneels before the god, receiving a staff and ring. Below, the laws are carved: fines, penalties, procedures. On the surface, it is legal administration. Underneath it is theology, justice is divine, the king is its earthly channel, and therefore his judgments carry the weight of heaven. This framing serves several purposes. It unifies, in a landscape of city-states and shifting coalitions, a claim that the gods have entrusted all these lands to me can help bind conquered peoples under a single ideological roof. Your former local gods become subordinates to the great god of the imperial centre. Your local ruler becomes a governor under the king chosen by Marduk or named by Enlil. It deters. If you consider rebellion, the propaganda assures you that the gods see and will respond. In some royal curses inscribed on bricks and foundations, the king calls down terrifying images on anyone who alters or destroys his work. May the great gods overthrow his kingship, break his weapon, pour out his seed like water. To damage the king's inscription is framed as an offence not just against his memory, but against the divine order that set him up. And it comforts, or tries to. When things go well, when the canals are full and the enemies quiet, the idea that kingship comes from heaven reassures people that their world is anchored. The king performs pious rituals, restores temples, feeds the gods properly. The gods, in turn, establish a firm foundation for the land. When things go badly, the same idea becomes terrifying. If the enemy is at the gate, if famine spreads, people look not only to military defences, but to the palace and temple rituals. Has the king failed the gods? Have the gods decided to change their dwelling, to take kingship elsewhere? This is where theology and statecraft fuse into a single system of risk management. The palace funds the temple. The temple legitimizes the palace. Royal building projects are almost always framed as temple projects. I rebuilt the ruined shrine of my lord. I enlarged the dwelling of the great gods. In return, hymns and rituals present the king as beloved of the deity whose name the goddess has called. The more deeply this language seeps into public life, the harder it becomes to question royal power without also questioning the gods. Yet the texts themselves never let the king forget that he is vulnerable. Even the proudest inscriptions end with prayers and curses that admit the possibility of erasure. The king asks future rulers to respect his works and repeat his name in prayers, because he knows how easily time and conquest can wipe a dynasty away. He asks the gods to cast down anyone who dares to alter his inscriptions, because he has seen cities burned and statues carried off. He knows how it looks when a god abandons his king. In that knowledge lies a constant low thrum of dread, not just among ordinary people wondering if their offerings were enough, but in the mind of the man on the throne who must go to bed each night asking, in his own way, whether the invisible council above has decided that his days of kingship are over. In this world, fear did not only live in omens and royal rituals, it seeped into the most private spaces of the mind. The clearest window we have into that interior landscape is what scholars call lament literature. These are long, flowing poems copied on clay tablets, sometimes spoken by a city, sometimes by a temple, sometimes by a single sufferer. They are not calm hymns of praise. They are voices crying out because something has gone terribly wrong, and no one can quite say why. One recurring theme is almost painfully simple. I am suffering, but I do not know what I did. In one Akkadian prayer, often called a prayer to any god, the speaker says, "The sin that I have done I do not know, the offence that I have committed I do not know." Line after line repeats the same bewilderment. The sufferer lists possibilities. Maybe I neglected an offering, broke an oath, failed a vow. Maybe I offended my personal god or my goddess, my city's deity or some unknown divine power. The text never specifies the crime. It only describes the punishment, sickness, social isolation, a sense that my God has left me and gone far away. This is dread turned inward. If the Anunnaki and the great gods above are judges, their anger is often experienced not as a lightning bolt but as a silence, a turning of the face. You are ill or unlucky, or everything you try fails. You look for reasons in your own heart and find only guesses. The laments lean into that uncertainty. They name it. They make it bearable by putting it into words. Sumerian city laments, composed after real historical destructions, do something similar on a larger scale. When falls to invaders in the early 2nd millennium BCE, a poet imagines the city itself speaking. It remembers how Enlil once favoured it, how kings ruled under his protection. Then comes the reversal. Enlil set his mind to destroy his city, rained flame upon its people, handed its kingship over to a foreign land. The lament does not simply accept this as just. It is full of grief and protest. Cries that it was once faithful, that its rituals were correct, its canals flowing, its granaries full. It describes mothers wandering the ruins, children carried off into captivity, the temple left empty. The city asks, indirectly, how such a thing could be allowed. But the poem never fully answers its own question. It circles around the idea that the divine council changed its decision, that fate was rewritten, that the days of Ur's kingship were completed, and that was that. Underneath, you can feel the same bewilderment as in the personal prayers. What tipped the scales? Which sin? Whose failure drew down this sentence? For people living in such a universe, one response is confession. Not confession in the later detailed juridical sense, but a flood of apologies in every direction just in case. Many prayers begin with long self-accusations. I am a man who has committed sins. I am heavy with guilt. My transgressions are many, known and unknown. The speaker does not necessarily know the specific offence. He acknowledges the possibility of having offended in countless small ways. Then come the pleas for mercy. Over and over, the gods are addressed as Father, Mother, Lord who knows mercy, Lady who hears the cry. Even the Anunnaki below, feared as stern judges, are sometimes invoked in this mode as those who can commute a sentence, soften a decree, turn a binding decision into a lighter fate. These prayers are strategies against dread. If you cannot identify the exact cause of divine anger, you can still perform humility. You can admit fault in the broadest possible terms, throw yourself on the God's compassion, promise better offerings, renewed devotion, more careful observance. There is a paradox here. The very uncertainty that makes fear so acute also drives people closer to their gods. If you never quite know where you stand, you have to keep talking, keep apologizing, keep honoring. The distance between human and divine becomes a channel of constant communication, thick with words of sorrow and hope. Communities do the same thing on a collective scale. After a siege, a plague, a flood that tears away the canals, the damage is not just physical. It is theological. People need to know, was this random misfortune or a sign that the gods have turned away? Lament rituals provide a way to process that question without pretending to fully answer it. In some Mesopotamian cities, priests would lead public ceremonies where professional singers recited laments over ruined temples or endangered shrines. They might bring out divine statues, dress them in mourning garments, recite lines about the god's sadness at leaving his dwelling, the goddess's tears over her broken city. Historically, we cannot reconstruct every detail of these performances, and different cities followed different traditions. But the pattern is clear. The community gathers, it hears in stylized, beautiful language that the gods themselves are not indifferent. They too weep, they too moan, they too seek a favourable day to return. The catastrophe is framed not only as punishment, but as a temporary withdrawal, a crisis in a relationship that can, perhaps, be healed. Through lament, people rehearse a narrative in which their suffering has a place in a larger story. They acknowledge guilt without necessarily pinpointing it. They present themselves as still belonging to their God, still servants, still the people called by his name. They ask the Anunnaki and the higher gods to reconsider, to loosen the net, to lift the ban, to let the city rise from the dust. Fear, in this context, does not erase devotion. It intensifies it. The more terrifying the gods' hidden decisions, the more desperately people seek to stay in contact, through daily prayers, through offerings, through long formal laments copied and recopied on clay. A person who believes the Anunnaki judge every soul below, who has been taught that Enlil might grow angry with a city, that Inanna might unleash war when slighted, does not simply stop believing. They live more carefully. They speak more often. They apologize for what they understand and for what they do not. Even the most anguished laments rarely end in rejection of the divine. Instead, they end in hope, or at least in continued address. Turn your face back to me. Look with favour on your city. Let your heart be appeased. These refrains echo across centuries of tablets. They show a kind of emotional logic. If the gods can be angered, they can also be soothed. If fate can be decreed, perhaps it can also be revised. Under the shadow of unseen anger, worship becomes not a calm, assured practice, but an ongoing negotiation, a long, trembling conversation with powers that might be listening, or might be silent. Out of that trembling comes some of the most intimate religious poetry the ancient world has left us, and a picture of piety that is as much about fear and apology as it is about praise. And while later ages would retell the stories of the Anunnaki in very different ways, that core experience, the attempt to live with gods who are both protectors and potential destroyers, never quite disappears. If you hear the word Anunnaki today, the first image that may rise in your mind is not a row of shadowy judges in the Mesopotamian underworld. It might be something else entirely. Tall, otherworldly beings descending from the sky. Ancient astronauts, lost technology, secret genetic experiments. A story in which the clay tablets of Sumer are not poetry and ritual, but encrypted records of contact with extraterrestrials. This is not how the oldest sources talk about them. In the texts copied on clay, the Anunnaki are a category of gods, the great ones of heaven and earth, or, in many later sources, the judges of the underworld. They appear in myths, hymns, incantations, and ritual instructions woven into a complex polytheistic landscape that grew and changed over more than 2,000 years. There is no single simple job description. Sometimes the word seems to mean the great gods as a group. Sometimes it refers more specifically to divine powers in the netherworld, seated in assembly to hear the dead. Sometimes a list will name 7 Anunnaki, other times 50 or more. The details shift with genre, period, and city. What they are not, in any straightforward way, is a race of physical visitors from another planet. So how did we get from one picture to the other? Part of the answer lies in the nature of the evidence itself. Cuneiform texts are fragmentary. Our knowledge is full of gaps. Tablets broke in antiquity, crumbled in the ground, were reused as building material. Whole libraries have vanished. The stories we reconstruct are often patchwork, lines missing, names half preserved. Into those gaps, imagination flows very easily. Then there is language. Sumerian and Akkadian are long-dead languages, written in a script that combines syllabic signs with older logograms. A single sign can sometimes be read several ways. Words shift meaning across time and context. Many terms for divine beings are difficult to match cleanly with later categories like God, spirit, demon, ghost. Specialists work with conventions, comparisons, and a great deal of caution. Outside that small circle, things are looser. A phrase that in a scholarly edition is translated as great gods might be rendered in a popular book as those who from heaven to earth came, with capital letters and a different kind of symbolism attached. A word for craft or sanctuary can be reimagined as ship. A poetic description of a god's radiance becomes a literal shining suit. Metaphor is read as engineering, You can see the process. A text that originally expressed awe at a divine presence. He shone like the sun. He crossed the great heaven. He descended in glory is reinterpreted as a technical report, an object blazing like a star, crossing the sky, landing on earth. Add to this the fact that Mesopotamian gods really are described as giving civilization to humans, teaching kings how to rule, revealing crafts, establishing laws, constructing temples. They are said to shape the first humans out of clay, mixed with the blood or essence of a god, in order to carry out labour. It does not take much to recast that mythic language into the framework of genetic engineering and alien overseers. Modern authors do not only lean on the tablets themselves, they draw on a long chain of translation, retranslation, sometimes misreading, sometimes deliberate exaggeration. They borrow pieces from later myths, biblical texts, and occult traditions, then stitch them together into a new, coherent story in which the Anunnaki are no longer feared judges and cosmic functionaries, but the hidden puppeteers behind human history. You can map the steps. First come early translations of cuneiform that were imperfect, sometimes misleading. Then 19th and early 20th century popularizers, who already liked to connect Mesopotamia with Atlantis, with the Bible, with any mystery on offer. Later, in the second half of the 20th century, the idea of ancient visitors from space enters mass culture through science fiction, the space race, and speculative non-fiction. By the time TV documentaries and internet forums join in, Anunnaki has become a flexible symbol. It can mean whatever a particular theory needs it to mean: rebel gods, genetic engineers, reptilian overlords, luminous teachers. The same word that once named a divine assembly in the underworld is now an empty container waiting to be filled. There are reasons people find these newer stories compelling. They offer a sense of pattern in a confusing historical record. Ancient architecture looks impossibly heavy. Mythic stories feel strange and grand. Whole civilizations rise and fall, leaving behind fragments we do not fully understand. Instead of patient, uncertain reconstruction, the alien Anunnaki narrative offers a single, sweeping explanation. Someone more advanced did this. It is emotionally satisfying. It also lets human beings reframe their place in the universe. Instead of being small creatures who slowly stumbled into writing, metal, and law over millennia, we become the project of higher minds. Our wars, our sufferings, even our religions can be read as the side effects of a larger, secret drama. It is a way of making chaos feel designed. There is also an appeal in the idea of forbidden knowledge. If they don't want you to know that the Anunnaki were extraterrestrials, then learning about it feels like resistance, like initiation into a special circle of understanding. The actual difficulties of cuneiform philology, broken tablets, scribal habits, scribal errors make it easy for someone to say the experts are hiding something. From a historian's perspective, though, when we strip away the modern scaffolding and go back to the clay, a different picture comes into focus. The Anunnaki belong to a world where divine power is everywhere and can turn at any moment. A world where floods can erase a city, where kings live and die by omens, where sickness is not just biology but a sentence, and where the dead are judged by courts below. They are not benevolent space fathers, nor are they necessarily pure malice. They are part of a hierarchy of beings whose will is often opaque, sometimes protective, sometimes catastrophic. The tablets speak of decrees fixed on tablets of destiny, of binding words spoken in heavenly or chthonic assemblies, of judgments that send souls one way or another. They speak of fear, ritual, apology, hope. They do not describe rocket launches or star maps. They describe something older and, in its own way, more intimate, a relationship between fragile human lives and forces that seem impossibly large. There is room, of course, for imagination beyond the evidence. People have always retold old stories to answer new questions. But when we are asking what the ancient Mesopotamians themselves thought and felt, what made them whisper the name Anunnaki with a shiver? The surviving texts give us clearer guidance than any modern documentary. In those sources, dread is not ignorance dressed up as wonder. It is a rational posture in a universe ruled by unaccountable power. If storms can be the anger of Enlil, if love and war can both arrive within Anna's changing mood, if the Anunnaki below can decide how your soul will be received after death, then fear is not a mistake. It is a tension. It is the mind's way of acknowledging its own limits against a backdrop of vast, unpredictable agency. Later ages may turn the Anunnaki into visitors from distant stars, strip them of their altars and laments, and send them off in shining craft. But in the oldest stories, they remain what they always were, names for the sharp edge, where human vulnerability meets an overwhelming, unseen order. To live with that edge constantly in view is to live with dread. Not a panic that drives you wild, but a quiet, waking knowledge that your life, your city, your king, your children all stand under verdicts you cannot fully read. That knowledge, more than any spaceship or secret technology, is what gave the Anunnaki their power over ancient imaginations and what still lingers whenever their name is spoken in the dark. When you step back from all the details, names of gods, lists of offerings, catalogues of demons and omens, what remains is a particular texture of feeling. In the Mesopotamian world, reverence and dread were not opposites. They were two sides of the same posture toward reality. You could be grateful for the grain that grew, awed by the king's triumph, moved to tears by a hymn, and at the same time you could know with the same certainty that everything given could be taken away with a word spoken in a divine assembly you would never see. Judgment in this universe was not limited to the moment after death. It ran through everything. Gods judged kings yearly, sometimes daily, in their success or failure. They judged cities in whether the river rose kindly or broke its banks. They judged families in the birth of children, the outcome of lawsuits, the sudden appearance of a rash that might or might not be a sign of divine anger. When the Anunnaki were imagined sitting in council, they were not just weighing the souls of the dead. They were part of the machinery by which the world decided to tilt toward mercy or disaster. Fate, too, was not an abstract philosophical puzzle. It was a felt constraint. Tablets of destinies, written and sealed, meant that some things in life were fixed in ways no human effort could change. You could pray, apologize, perform rituals designed to loosen a harsh decree or soften a god's heart. Sometimes, according to the texts, it worked. Sometimes, just as plainly, it did not. In that tension between fixed decree and fragile petition, people learned to live with a kind of steady, alert humility. You could act, you should act, but you never mistook yourself for the final author of your story. Death brought this logic into clearest focus. No matter how carefully you observed ritual, no matter how generous your offerings, death remained a crossing over into a realm governed by others. The underworld of Mesopotamian imagination was not a place of heroic reward or fiery torture in the later sense. It was a dim continuation of existence shaped by the judgments and procedures of chthonic powers, often counted among the Anunnaki. To know that your name and your case would one day be spoken before those judges below was to carry a quiet weight in daily life. You could not see them, but they were already part of your horizon. Add to this the basic uncertainty of existence, floods, plagues, invasions, crop failure. In a land of great rivers and shifting skies, the line between a good year and catastrophe was thin, when every change in wind or water might signal a decision in a heavenly court. You lived with a fine-grained attentiveness to signs. That attentiveness was not only fearful, it was also devotional. The same gods who loomed as potential sources of ruin were also patrons, protectors, givers of wisdom and skill. The Anunnaki could condemn, but they could also uphold the cosmic order that made life possible at all. To ignore them would have been as irrational as ignoring the river that watered your fields. So dread in this setting was not merely terror. It was a way of being tuned to a world understood as alive with intention. It meant knowing that your choices mattered, but not alone. That your offerings meant something, but not everything. That the prayers you whispered at night were carried into assemblies you would never attend, where beings older and more powerful debated outcomes no human could predict. In that sense, reverence and fear work together to produce a particular kind of ethics, cautious, ritualized, always aware of limits. You honored the gods not because they were gentle, but because they were decisive. You feared them not because you hated them, but because you depended on them more than you could bear to admit. When we read about the Anunnaki now, across thousands of years, what reaches us is less the precise roster of divine names, and more this atmosphere. A universe in which judgment is real, fate has teeth, death is a courtroom as much as a curtain, and uncertainty is not a bug in the system, but one of its basic settings. For the people who once whispered those names in the dark, dread was not a mistake to be corrected. It was an honest response to the scale of the forces they felt pressing in around them. Lying here, listening, you may live in a different cosmos, with different explanations for storms and sickness, for love and loss. But the feeling of standing small before something unimaginably larger, that hasn't changed as much as we might like to think. If anything in this journey through their world has stayed with you, the image of distant judges, the weight of an unseen decree, the fragile line between safety and disaster, you can let it settle now, not as a threat, but as a reminder of how humans everywhere have tried to make sense of their own vulnerability. You can breathe with that thought in and out. The ancient names can drift to the edges of your mind. The tablets can return to their shelves. The great assembly can recede into silence. And you can let your own world grow softer and dimmer for the night. If you'd like to hear more stories like this, more slow walks through old texts and forgotten worlds, you can support the channel by tapping like, subscribing, and turning on notifications so you don't miss the next quiet history. I'd love to know where this finds you. If you feel like sharing, leave a comment telling me where you're listening from and what time it is for you right now. Middle of the night, early morning, somewhere in between. For now, you can let the names of the Anunnaki fade. Let the weight of ancient dread loosen its grip and allow yourself to rest. The gods of that old world can keep their watch. You have done enough for today.